All right, let's see how many children of the 60s we have here this morning. We've got a few. You know this song. Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock my soul. The bosom of Abraham, rock my soul. The bosom of Abraham, oh, rock my soul. Now sing it like you know it. Rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock my soul. The bosom of Abraham, rock my soul. The bosom of Abraham, oh, rock my soul. Here we go. So high you can't get over it, so low can't get under it, so wide you can't get around it, gotta go in through the door. All right. Maybe some of you like me learned that in Sunday school or Bible camp, or maybe from some Pete Seeger record or Peter, Paul, and Mary, or Elvis. Elvis recorded this one. He sang it a little different. I don't know how I got it. But I know he did it. Matter of fact, though, it didn't come out of the 60s, at least not the 1960s. It's an old Negro spiritual. It's a slave song from the 19th century. It comes right out of the gospel reading that you just heard a moment ago from Luke 16. Poor Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham, and it speaks of the chasm, the distance between desolation and the kingdom of heaven. There was once a rich man who dressed in purple clothing and fine linens, Armani suits, slept on 1,200-count Egyptian cotton every night, feasted sumptuously every day. And God looks down on this rich man and decides that he wants to give him a present, a gift. But what in the world do you give the guy who has the world, the guy who has everything? Well, God decides that God is going to offer him salvation. Salvation. What is salvation? Well, the Latin root of the word is salvo, from which we get the word salve, healing, something that heals. In Greek, it's soteria. Healing. Healing from some sickness, some disease. Salvation usually implies, when we think about it, a healing from something for something. Right? A healing from sickness for life, from sin for righteousness, from death for life, from selfishness to selflessness. When the Bible talks about salvation, it's almost always talking about God saving people from themselves. So when God looks down at the rich guy in our parable, he decides to give him salvation. He wants to save this man from himself. Why does he need saving? Good question. Doesn't look like he needs saving. Looks like he's doing all right, right? He's got everything he needs. Well, maybe because God recognizes that the more a person lives for themselves, the smaller that life becomes, and then the greater the distance grows between that life and all the other lives around it. A life lived taking care of oneself is always ultimately a small, shallow shadow of a life. And God wants more than just that isolating, lonely, hellish experience for any of his children. I don't really need to argue the point, do I, that a life lived for oneself is a hellish experience. We all have probably learned the truth of that somewhere along the line as we've known people whose concerns rarely go beyond the boundaries of their own wants and needs. Right? People who define their existence by what they have in their possession or by what they aspire to acquire someday, something or some things that might give them a sense of security, a sense of meaning. They tend to be very lonely people because they're always chasing after the next thing, terribly isolated and frustrated and unsatisfied. And that kind of life is a tragedy and, frankly, a living hell. God does not want the rich man in our story to be that kind of tragic figure, and so he sends him the gift of salvation, the opportunity to live outside of himself and his own wants. The trouble is, the package does not come wrapped very attractively, does it? Pretty much just skin and bones, covered in sores, hungry, laying at his gate. Jesus' little story here in the 16th chapter of Luke kind of harkens back to the second chapter of that same gospel. It talks about how God and Jesus came into the world in the first place. One of no account, helpless outside the gate, waiting to be received by the ones that he would redeem. A poor man laying at the gate of a rich man, a baby born in a stable because the world had no room for him. Ring a bell? A guy of means, perhaps even a pretty decent guy, right? An honest businessman who loved his wife and made sure his kids got the best that he could give them, but nonetheless a man who ignores the opportunity to step outside of himself and receive the gift of living for someone other than just him and his own. Probably because he simply didn't see the one at his gate. A world that ignores the birth of the Messiah because he doesn't look like their idea of a king. All of these things sound familiar. A poor man lying outside the gate of a rich man. A poor man of whom the prophet Isaiah easily could have been writing in Isaiah 53, where he says, "He has had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity. As one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised and we held him of no account." And so he stays there, outside the gate, until he dies. And what follows next in Jesus' little story is this rather frightening portrayal of what happens as a result of the rich man's ignoring the opportunity at his gate, right? That guy's up to his eyebrows in hellfire, while the one in whom God chose to dwell is having his soul rocked in the bosom of Abraham. Our tendency might be to infer from this little turn of events that God is just waiting, rubbing his hands together, waiting to throw people headlong into hell who don't toe the mark in this life. But that would seem to be contrary to everything we know about God in Jesus, right? Who desires nothing for his children but life, what Paul called in that letter to Timothy, the life that truly is life. And it strikes me that maybe Jesus is a whole lot less concerned with the afterlife than he is with this life, the one we're living right now. The late philosopher by the name of Dallas Willard once wrote this. He said, "The gospel is less about how to get into the kingdom of heaven after you die, and a whole lot more about how to live in the kingdom of heaven before you die." The rich man, finding himself across the chasm at his death, is really nothing more than an extension of the reality that he's already been living his whole life. It's not a distance of space, of feet or of yards or of miles. Lazarus lay right outside this guy's gate, not very far. In fact, that guy even knew Lazarus' name. He calls out to him from across the chasm. No, it's a distance rather of feeling, a distance of recognition, a distance of relationship. Just a few verses before this little story shows up in Luke's gospel, the Pharisees are identified as being, quote, lovers of money, which fit right in with their accepted notion that folks got from God exactly what they deserved in this life. In other words, if they were well off, they themselves, the Pharisees, if they were well off, well, that must be a sign of God's approval, that they were pretty righteous folks. And likewise then, if you are not well off, that must be God's judgment on you for somehow not being righteous enough. And so the distance grows, you see, between those who have and between those who don't. They become invisible in their poverty, and then it becomes okay to ignore them and to ignore their need. And isn't this particular heresy still haunting us today? Isn't it easy to block from our sight those who are just a little bit lower on the economic strata than we ourselves? Because we figure, well, They must deserve their station in life. Somehow they must have brought it upon themselves by what they did or didn't do. What's interesting to me in this story, though, that Jesus tells, is that never once, not once, does he bother to mention why Lazarus is at that gate, how he ended up there. Doesn't say. All it says is he's there in all of his need, just waiting to be seen. His only compassionate ministers being the dogs, licking his sores, which doesn't surprise any of us who are familiar with the compassion of dogs as over against a lot of humans we might know. Right? The distance from Lazarus to our unnamed rich man in this story may have only been mere feet, but it could just as well have been 1,000,000 miles. And how many other chasms are present between people today, keeping them from recognizing the humanity of another? How many? Do we have time to count them? The distances, the chasms felt by political biases, or religious creeds, or racial prejudices, or sexual identities, or national boundaries, you name it. The list goes on and on and on. So high, you can't get over it. So low, you can't get under it. So wide, you can't get around it. Got to go in through the door. In other words, the only way to close the distance is to start seeing the neighbor at your gate and recognizing salvation from yourself through that door. That's it. I shared with the group that was gathered here on Wednesday night a powerful witness that I received a few years back when I was in Rapid City for a conference gathering of Lutheran pastors. And that morning we had as our guest speaker Steve Allender, who was at that time the chief of police for Rapid City. Now he's the mayor of Rapid. But he was telling us a story speaking about the distance that we create between ourselves when we fail to see the humanity in one another. He was driving his little girl to school one morning through the streets of downtown Rapid, and up ahead, he noticed how cars were kind of swinging wide from the right lane over into the left, kind of going away from the curb. And as they got closer, he could see that it was an indigenous male looking like one of the many homeless vagrants living on the streets of Rapid City, severely drunk and passed out in the gutter just off the curb over one of the grates in the street. And his little girl sat up and was looking out the window, and she said, "Oh, Daddy, look, it's a person." She said, "It's a person." And he said, "I've never felt so convicted in my life." Because he said, I'm so used, so conditioned to seeing a problem. Another vagrant drunk in the gutter. Now that I have to stop and waste my time and call it in and get him off the street. And my 7-year-old daughter saw the truth of it. A person worthy of stopping for, a person worth some dignity and some compassion. You see, the distance, heaven and hell. Heaven and hell is ours to live in. Right here, right now. It's choosing to be comfortable with the distance and its isolation, or instead choosing to close the chasm by seeing Christ in our neighbor. In Christ, God would have that distance be closed and the door flung wide open, but it's only received through faith, buried in the mystery of Jesus' own suffering and death in the form of one who is despised and rejected. It only comes through Lazarus at your gate. It's every child who can't pay their lunch bill at school. It's every family living out of their car. It's every person of color trembling with fear at a traffic stop. It's every man sleeping on the street tonight. It's every battered woman. It's every dying patient. Every suffering and isolated and lonely human being. How else do you imagine Jesus would show up to you? How else do you imagine he would come to you with the gift of life? Amen.